So let me just end by saying a few words about feminism, because alongside all this activism, these aspirations for change in different fields, there's often an argument within feminism whether it's about action or whether it's about thought. And of course most people would say it's a combination of the two. But feminism, of course, in a way describes the intellectual theories, the intellectual battles that have gone on alongside these struggles for rights and equality of the kind I've been outlining. Now, to give a very, very brief history of feminism, we might divide it into 4 waves. Now, I should say that this word wave is not my own. It's the commonly used term to describe these different moments or different emphases within feminism. It's not without its controversies or its controversial aspects, but people would defend it first by saying it continues the notion of fluidity, that somehow these things are not fixed, but it also shows that these are not distinct periods as such, but they're different movements that blend into one another, and different emphases come and go at different times. Anyhow, the first wave of feminism is dated usually back to about the middle of the 19th century, although actually you can of course go much further back than then. Of course there have for centuries been women conscious of their lack of rights and their desire for something better. Very important figures here appeared, for example, at the end of the 18th century. You get the revolution in the United States, you get the revolution in France, the demand for greater democracy, greater rights for the ordinary working person, which was normally understood, of course, to be male. Although around the time of these revolutions you got the likes of Thomas Paine writing pamphlets about the rights of man, and alongside that his friend Mary Wollstonecraft writing the rights of women and saying, well, we should have these rights as well. And in fact, one thing we're going to notice is that the struggle for women's rights really does bind itself up with the struggle for other kinds of rights for men of lower classes, of slaves, of people of different ethnicities. Really, it was in the 1840s that the campaign to abolish the slave trade, to get rid of slavery, was really in full swing. And women were very, very active in this campaign and could not help but notice that some of the rights they were fighting for slaves were not ones that they themselves enjoyed. Incidentally, I should have said that I will also place in the written part of this lesson some links to some articles that you might want to read if you're interested in these different waves of feminism and their connection with other movements going on in the time. Anyhow, as the 19th century progressed, women were demanding greater rights. But what's seen as very important here actually is the outbreak of the First World War, particularly in Britain, because the suffrage movement, the movement campaigning for women to have the right to vote, this movement agreed to put that campaign on hold for the duration of the First World War, which ran from 1914 to 1918. And it was one of those wars that took a lot of manpower, literally, in the fighting. All waves and waves of young men were sent into the trenches and then killed. So women had to fill the gap left behind. They had to work in the factories making bombs, making food. They had to work on the farms and so on. And of course, by doing such a good job, it was confirmation that they deserved the vote. So it was really the First World War that confirmed women getting the vote and certain rights in 1918. But in any case, this first wave of feminism was very much focused on acquiring political and legal rights for women. Then the second wave, as you can see on the screen, it's associated primarily with the 60s, although of course it's a continuation of the first wave in many ways. The 60s were a time of great social upheaval and it's when the civil rights movement, especially in the United States, was underway. And this was a demand that from African Americans, for example, that even though in theory they had similar rights to the white population, they weren't actually being enjoyed in practice. So what they wanted was equality, and this became the primary concern for second wave feminists too. There's not just enough to have certain rights, we need to have equality with men as well. The third wave, which as you can see is usually associated with the 1980s, also is mixed up with issues of race in particular, and to a degree it marks a backlash against certain second wave feminists, because what feminists at this period began to feel was that it had become too easy to assume that a woman was one thing, easily describable, that somehow all women were fundamentally the same. And women at this time, in particular feminists, were looking around and saying, well, it's simply not the case that a white woman in Britain or the United States, born in the middle classes, has the same experiences, has the same rights as, say, an immigrant woman would have, and that women of different ethnicities, different classes and so on, all had different experiences and experienced the rights they supposedly had in different ways. And of course then these categories as a whole began to break down. Why should a middle class woman be exactly the same as another middle class woman too? So this is when feminism in a way becomes overtly plural. The idea that there are many feminisms just as there are many forms of femininity. So this is breaking away from the idea, of course, that identity is something fixed and static, that all women are fundamentally the same. So this is the idea then that gender, like other aspects of our identity, is not a given, it's not something nature imposes on us, but it's something that we perform. Men and women express their masculinity and or their femininity through the choices they make and the actions that they take. So the key word here then is multiplicity. And this, in a way, is an issue that foreshadowed in Woolf's speech Professions for Women. She asks at one point, and I'm quoting her again, "What is a woman? I assure you I do not know. I do not believe that you know. I do not believe that anybody can know until she has expressed herself in all the arts and professions open to human skill." And this third wave feminism is an extension of that actually there are no limits to what a woman is, to what it is to be feminism. It's a constant process that each person performs, enacts and creates for themselves. So this brings us finally on to the fourth wave. And I should say that in histories of feminism, in feminist thought, the first three waves I think are broadly accepted now. The fourth wave is much more controversial. Many people would say it's basically just the third wave in a new form. But this is a recognition of the importance that the internet has come to play in human life in performing and enacting our identities. That so much of how we behave, of how we express ourselves, of how we enact, how we correlate with the world outside us is mediated through media and the internet. Now, as I said, from some perspectives this is basically an extension of the third wave. It's just the third wave with a technological upgrade, as it were. But in accordance with people working in other fields as well, a number of feminists would say there is a distinctive fourth wave precisely because what the internet has done, digital technologies, has transformed our lives, our societies to such a degree that it does mark something distinct from anything that has gone before.